Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special panel discussion on voter suppression, its possible role in the 2024 presidential election, and what we can do moving forward. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I am Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers. Black Nonbelievers is a 501c3 nonprofit organization headquartered in the Atlanta, Georgia area. We connect with other Blacks and allies who are living free from religion and might otherwise be shunned by family members and friends, and we provide a caring, informative, and festive community. Instead of accepting dogma, we determine truth and morality through reason and evidence. The mission of Black Nonbelievers is to provide secular fellowship, nurture and support nonbelievers in coming out, educate the general public on the history and current state of nonbelief in Black communities, encourage pride in non-religious identities, and organize events and charitable causes. Black Nonbelievers welcomes all, regardless of age, gender identity, sexual identity, age, and national origin. However, our work prioritizes Black non-religious voices. And just a few words before we get started, I'd like to thank our partners at the Secular Coalition for America and the Center for Freethought Equality for joining us and partnering with us on this very important discussion. As we are currently in Black History Month, 2025, there have certainly been many obstacles and challenges that many Black folks have had to overcome in our communities. And one of them has been the right to vote. And as we can see, as we are seeing in this current political climate, that there is an intentional push to set the clock back to where people of color have no rights, where Black folks have no rights, women have no rights, LGBTQ folks have no rights. And part of our mission as an organization is to encourage folks to get involved and stay involved in civic engagement, especially as non-religious people. A huge part of our identities and how we live is how we function in communities and us knowing what our rights are as a people and also what we can do about them. And the time is now for us, even though this election cycle is sort of done, we have yet to see what the ramifications are of the election results. And according to a report by Greg Pallas, which we will share in the chat, there is evidence of voter suppression in leading up to this past election. And it is important now more than ever moving forward that if we would like to avoid as much as possible a repeat of this happening again. It is important that as a demographic and a community that we continue to move forward, that we continue to engage and participate within our respective organizations and collaborating with each other moving forward. And also to be empowered, to learn what we can do, what we can look out for, and also how we are working with our partner organizations to make all of this possible. And so with that, I would like to welcome our distinguished panel of guests for this discussion. A few housekeeping items. We'd like to ask everyone to mute your microphones while the discussion is taking place. This discussion will focus on the history of voter suppression, what is going on currently, and what we can do in the future. Please hold all questions until the end of the initial discussion. You can post some questions in the chat. We will be taking notes. And if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A portion, please just raise your hand, use the raise hand icon, and we will get to you as soon as we possibly can. And before we get started, I'd like to invite everyone that if you haven't already become a member of Black Nonbelievers, please do become an official member. Also, you can make your tax-deductible donation to support the work we do, and also participate in our upcoming events. We have the Revival of Reason coming up in March, from March 21st to the 23rd, which we are offering both in-person and virtual registrations. There is still an opportunity to support this event. If you are an organization or if you're an individual who would like to support the organization. And we have SeaCon coming up in November, where we have some wonderful speakers for both events. And so again, the support for our work helps us to continue to produce virtual sessions and in-person events, our charitable events. We do still co-sponsor a student scholarship with the Secular Student Alliance. And it also helps us engage and represent with our coalition partners. And so we thank you all once again for joining us here this evening. So with that, I will introduce our panel. First up, we have Ms. Cynthia McDonald, who is our leader for our Chi-Town affiliate of Black Nonbelievers. Cynthia is a health and political advocate that works with various organizations in Chicago and nationwide to achieve social and economic justice for Black freedmen descendants, pushes for health equality for marginalized groups in the United States, and normalizing atheism in Black communities. Cynthia has been a guest on several podcasts and is a regular host on the Nonprofits produced by the Atheist Community of Boston and Women Atheists Unload, produced by the Skeptic Haven channel. Cynthia, in addition to being the leader for BN Chi-Town affiliate, is also a member of the Godless Gospel Ensemble with yours truly. Welcome, Cynthia, to the program. And also, I'd like to welcome Stephen Emmert, the Executive Director for the Secular Coalition for America. Stephen is an experienced nonprofit executive, having worked in the policy, advocacy, and health sectors. He is a firm believer that the voice of the secular community needs to be expanded and more broadly heard. The rise of Christian nationalism has him even more committed to our work and mission. Having worked for Planned Parenthood affiliates in nearly all parts of the country, Stephen has advocated for health access and equity in 8 state capitals as well as on Capitol Hill. While his passion is healthcare, he is critically aware that it all starts with a firm foundation of separating the affairs of the state from those of religion. He has served as the executive director for the Secular Coalition for America for over 2 years now. And our third panelist is Ron Millar, who is the political and PAC manager at the Center for Freethought Equality. He brings over 40 years of experience working for nonprofit education and advocacy groups in the nation's capital, including serving as the associate director of the Secular Coalition for America from 2005 to 2009. Working to increase the representation of humanists, atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers in public office, Ron conducts research and interviews with political candidates and elected officials to determine possible endorsements by the Center for Freethought Equality Political Action Committee, PAC, also known as the Freethought Equality Fund. His academic background includes a PhD from Virginia Tech, where he examined organizational learning among groups litigating church-state courses before the Supreme Court. Welcome to our distinguished panel of colleagues and wonderful folks who will be discussing this issue at hand, which is very important. and also where we go from here and how we can all become empowered and more engaged. So we'll start with Cynthia as we talk about the history of voter suppression, and we will have commentary from Stephen and Ron, and then we will go into in the current political arena led by Stephen, with commentary from Cynthia and Ron, and then looking to the future and how we can get more involved with Ron, led by Ron, and then commentary from Cynthia and Stephen. So from there, we will start with Cynthia.
Thank you, Mandisa, for that beautiful introduction. Also, thank you, Ron and Stephen, for being here, and everybody else that actually came to join this discussion. We really do appreciate you coming and also participating as well. So I am going to be speaking a little bit about voter suppression and basically where it came from and where it has ended up in our current electorate, and also, how to recognize it as well as we go forward with our elections. So, Andy, if you want to go ahead and share the slides, if that's okay. Okay, so if we want to go ahead and start talking about voter suppression, or even where we have come when it comes to voting in itself. So I know that you may not know this, dear audience members, but did you know that not everybody at the inception of the United States could vote? I know it's shocking, but it's true. Not everybody had the right to vote when the inception of this country happened. We know that in 1776, July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was written, penned by Thomas Jefferson, and it was said that we now declare ourselves a separate nation from England, and we are a sovereign nation, but we have our own rules and regulations and how we govern ourselves, and you, King George, can't do a damn thing about it. Well, after there was a whole Revolutionary War, there was first the Articles of Confederation that were drafted. The founders didn't particularly care for the articles because they felt that they were too state-centered and too weak. So they were scrapped. And then we got, in 1789, the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, even before the Constitution of the United States of America, the only people who were considered the civilized class were the ones who could vote. So what do you mean by civilized class, Cynthia? Well, I'm glad you asked. Civilized class meant Christian English landowner. Christian English landowner man, basically. And that quickly, after the 1670s turned and in 1680s turned into white male landowner. Those are the only ones who could vote. And they kept that particular edict when it came to voting all the way up into the end of the Civil War. So what was the Civil War? The Civil War was a conflict between the North and the South. I know a lot of people like to say it was states' rights and something about, heritage. That's crap. It was about preserving slavery. And after the Civil War was fought and won by the North, won by the Union, there were a series of amendments that went into the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment actually granted slaves freedom unless they get convicted. But that's a different story, and that's a different task for us to talk about. The 14th Amendment gave equal protection of the law and, some other civil rights that was supposed to be recognized by the United States of America towards its newly free slaves, and also birthright citizenship. And then we had the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment was the one that actually made voting legal for African American men too, and also poor white men as well. So poor white men who did not have land, who owned nothing, etc., can now vote. Black men who were formerly enslaved could now vote. Everybody except for women had the right to vote. However, voting for African American men was almost non-existent in some places, especially in the South, because of the threats, violence, and unethical practices like poll taxes. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So shortly after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, there was still a very harsh and wide practice portion of voter suppression that came in the wake of poll taxes and literacy tests, which was between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So literacy tests were legal obstacles implemented in the United States, primarily in the South, aimed at disenfranchising African American voters and, in some cases, poor white voters. These tests were often designed to be confusing and difficult, serving as a means to maintain white supremacy and control over the political process during and after Reconstruction. Though the era of the New South and into the civil rights movement, through this era of the New South and the civil rights movement. And the New South would have emerged, I would say, after the Lost Cause, where the Daughters of Confederacy actually told the story that, the South actually won. But the thing is that, the South also fought for its heritage and its and states' rights, and basically it's going to tell a story, which was a myth, that the South did not fight against the Union to continue to keep slavery, which it absolutely did. But again, that's a different story. Next slide, please. So in order to help out the poor whites, mostly poor white men, who were considered, they're within the fray of African American slaves or people who were newly freed from taking these literacy tests, is they had grandfather clauses. So grandfather clauses were these laws in the South that allowed white voters to bypass literacy tests and poll taxes if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote. So if the grandfather, let's say, owned land, he was a farmer, he was a slave owner, and you didn't inherit your 40 acres and a mule yet, different story, then okay, we'll grandfather you into this particular clause so that you can vote too. So the term grandfathered actually has become part of the language. It's an easy way to describe individuals or companies who get to keep operating under an existing set of expectations when the new rules are put in place. The grandfather clause in this particular aspect is actually not a means of disenfranchising anybody, says Michael Klarman, who was a Harvard law professor. It actually was a means of enfranchising whites who might have been excluded by things like literacy clauses. It was politically necessary because otherwise you'd have too much opposition from poor whites who would have felt that they were disenfranchised. I find it funny that anybody from Harvard Law says that, oh no, it was enfranchising people. It was great. Everybody should try it. Next slide, please. So not too long after we had grandfather clauses, poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clauses, the lost cause, all this other great stuff, we had the repealing of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a time period where the Union Army was occupying the South in order to give its Black residents protection from basically white domestic violence. But after there was, some murmurings in the back, I forgot which president. I'm pretty sure that either Ron or Stephen can help me out after that. That made a deal to repeal the Union Army. I'm pretty sure the Mandisa probably knows too. Then basically Reconstruction was over. And not too long after Reconstruction was a thing of the past, we get Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow, after more than 500,000 Black men joined the voting rolls during Reconstruction in the 1870s, helping to elect nearly 2,000 Black men to public office, Mississippi led the way in using measures to circumvent the 15th Amendment. Mississippi's Jim Crow law era then set a precedent for other Southern states to use the same tactics to assault Black enfranchisement for nearly a century until the passage of the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. And if you look at the little blurb that's under Jim Crow laws, it's basically a systematic racial segregation and disenfranchisement through laws, intimidation, and violence that made it nearly impossible for Black citizens to vote in many Southern states. Next slide, please. After 100 years of disenfranchisement with the with Jim Crow law era, we get the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement roughly started around 1953, 1955, mostly said that the civil rights era started after the death of Emmett Till, who was a young Black boy who was killed in Mississippi. Basically maimed so bad that he was unrecognizable. His mother decided to have an open casket so that so that people could see what was done to her child. It was said that he whistled or he said some words to a white woman who didn't particularly care for that. And so later on, some white men came and basically ended his life. After the, people actually saw what, horrors happened to this child, it basically triggered, more people, especially Black folk, to actually start to join the movement. They marched, they did leaflets, they organized, Montgomery bus boycott, you have the Freedom Riders, et cetera, et cetera. If you all want to get more of a background of what happened during the Civil Rights Movement, I highly recommend watching Eyes on the Prize by PBS. It's an excellent documentary. And after the Civil Rights Movement, there was a series of laws that were enacted. And one of those, which is very, very important, is the Voter Rights Act of 1965, or otherwise known as the VRA. It is a landmark piece of civil rights legislation that had a profound effect on democracy. A major success of the civil rights era, it outlawed racial discrimination in voting, unlocking core tenets of political power, representation, and full citizenship for people of color, particularly Black Americans in the South. Throughout the years, the VRA has been used time and time again to protect and uphold equal rights and voting rights for voters of color. With the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, people of color at the stake in state and federal legislatures, it actually took away all of the Jim Crow era and even like some disenfranchisement during the Reconstruction, like for literacy tests, poll taxes, and supposedly intimidation from people who were at the polls. Next slide, please. So we get to 2013. We had roughly about 25 years, almost 30 years of the Voter Rights Act actually in play at the federal level. That was supposed to protect voters in order for them to be able to cast their votes without any type of issue. And then we got the pre-clearance provision struck down in 2013. So prior to 2013, Section 5 of the Voter Rights Act required states and localities with an extensive history of racially discriminatory voting practices to submit any changes in their election laws and policies or electoral district maps to the federal government for advance review before putting them into effect. And this is known as pre-clearance. However, the courts and the U.S. Department of Justice have interpreted Section 5 to apply to a wide category of election law related laws, ranging from statewide redistricting plans and voter ID laws, which are discriminatory, to changes as small as a local government's relocation of a polling place from one church or school to another nearby. The purpose of pre-clearance was to ensure that any changes in these covered jurisdictions did not discriminate against voters of color, either in their purpose or effect. And Section 5 is unique. Other voter rights laws, including other sections of the Voter Rights Act, required that government and adversely affected minority voters bring a lawsuit to challenge a law and to prove in court that the law was discriminatory. And this process was often both time-consuming and costly. Worse, until litigation continues, the discriminatory law often remains into effect, harming the ability of minority communities to even have effective access to the ballot. And I also like to put aside in here that this also helped usher in Citizens United, which caused corporations to be considered people. So this is where we end up getting PACs. I don't have an issue with like good PACs, like the one that Ron runs, but there are bad PACs that's out there that can accumulate, endless amounts of money, that can dump money into elections. And since corporations are people, that's fine now. And it can totally water down the effectiveness of the power of the people and their ability to vote and have their voices heard. Next slide, please. This led, as I mentioned previously, also to voter ID laws. I remember during McCain's run for president against Barack Obama, I believe in 2007, 2008, there was a state senator from Wisconsin that basically said the quiet part out loud because they started to implement voter ID restrictions in order for people to be able to vote in certain districts of the state. And he basically said, "Oh, this is going to help our side." And then when the reporter said, "What do you mean by that?" he was silent. But the use of restrictive voter laws to disenfranchise minority voters can be traced all the way back to Jim Crow, as I mentioned previously, including the literacy tests, poll taxes, and things of that nature, and other extenuating circumstances to intimidate Black Americans. Following the Voter Rights Acts, many of these taxes were outlawed, but you also ended up having other states that implemented voter ID laws. Now, most people would say that, "Oh, what's wrong with having an ID in order for you to vote?" Nothing per se. However, it becomes a problem when you move I was talking about previously, moving polling places that were historically in certain areas, but they're no longer there. So sometimes they do have like your voter information on file, but if that polling place is no longer existing, you have to go further, stand in line longer, and they may or may not have your information on file. Another thing that has happened as well with people who actually have issues with voter ID is that you had some DMV and Secretary of State offices either move or completely shut down in mostly populous minority communities. So it makes it more difficult for people to be able to get an ID in order for them to vote in the first place. I know that, some people say that everybody should have an ID, and I don't necessarily have an issue with that. But when you make it more difficult for people to get an ID, then you also make it more difficult for them to be able to participate in the electoral process. Next slide, please. Which leads us now to also early voting restrictions, mostly that happened in the 2010s to the present. Not too long after you had almost a trifecta in 2008 when you had a Democratic president, a democratically led Senate, and a democratically led Congress. Then you had a lot of the things that were utilized in order to mobilize people to vote to completely go away. That means you have polling places to go away. Early voting restrictions all of a sudden come into play. So places where you could go to vote early, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks before you had to do like your Super Tuesdays, are gone. There was also a movement, I guess you can call it, called Souls to the Polls, where mostly Black churches galvanized their congregations and also the neighboring communities in order to, gather people after you go listen to Jesus or whatever during Sunday service. They get you over to the polls so that you can also do early voting. All of a sudden, that's completely gone away. And you even had up until even recently, if people were wanting to participate in the voting process, are in lines for a very long time. Depending if they're going to be in a state where it could be kind of hot, people want to give them water. They some of those places actually outlawed for volunteers to give people who are standing in line to vote water. Insane. Next slide, please. We also have, and I'm just going to run through the rest of these as quickly as possible. I think that people are familiar with gerrymandering. This is the redrawing of district lines that dilute the political power of Black voters. The tactic has been used in many states to minimize the impact of Black voters and Black voter blocks. And the Supreme Court has allowed many of these practices to continue despite challenges. I think that one of the more famous challenges was in Alabama, where because of populists, there were supposed to be drawing 2 districts that were predominantly African American, and the state legislature decided to ignore that and just draw 1. Now they were sued by some state citizens to say that, no, you were told that you need to draw 2 districts that were predominantly African American. We want our 2 districts. And they completely ignored the Supreme Court. And it's kind of interesting, like how people can just like, all of a sudden just like have this backbone that says that we're just going to completely ignore the letter of the law in order for us to advance our own political practices. But hey, like Childish Gambino said, this is America. Next slide, please. We also are experiencing now felon disenfranchisement of various states, and that's continuously ongoing. In the audience, I know that Tina Marshall can really talk about this at extensiveness. And many states still bar individuals with felony convictions from voting, which disproportionately affect Black Americans due to systemic racial biases in the criminal justice system. Efforts to restore voters' rights for ex-felons are ongoing, but the progress is slow. I know that one of the states that actually had on the voters' docket to restore ex-felons' rights to vote was Florida. And there was a fight to be able to do that, to the point where I think that they're still fighting it, if I'm mistaken. Final slide, please. And now we get to today's discussion, which talks about voter rolls purging. So this has been going on for over 20 years now. And this is also something that was suspected of happening in the 2020 and the 2024 election, where some states have aggressively purged voters' rolls, removing thousands of voters, particularly in Black and low-income areas. These purges are often done under the pretext of maintaining accurate voter records, but they can disproportionately affect eligible or voters who may or may have not updated their information. I believe that one of the more famous cases was in Georgia in 2016, where you had the Stacey Abrams running and you also had Brian Kemp running. Brian Kemp was also the Secretary of State, and he was running for governor and ended up purging over 50,000 people from the voters' rolls. Now, some of the people ended up actually getting back on the voters' rolls, but in a lot of cases, it was too late. And sometimes these challenges that are happening to people while they were on the voters' rolls and taking off are completely arbitrary. It could be for like the tiniest things. Oh, you didn't put a middle initial on your voters' rolls, or your name was not spelled correctly, or your mother's maiden name was not said, and just like crazy things. And nowadays we have an issue where people that voter vigilantes have been activated to the point that they can even be in a different state and still challenge people from another state that's on voters' rolls. It's insane. And so that's my portion, people, of my presentation. And I am going to yield my time to the panel so that they can go ahead and jump in and say things. Stephen, Ron.
Where were you when I was learning history? So, it's good stuff. Thank you.
Thanks.
And yeah, if I could just expand on a point you made about Reconstruction post Civil War, and yes, it was once again that damn Electoral College that couldn't come up with a majority in 1876, I think, and the Rutherford B. Hayes people agreed. Not like officially, but they said, "Yeah, we'll end Reconstruction and say it's all good now down in the South, so the Union troops can come home." And Mandisa and I, in fact, had a conversation about this in leading up to this tonight, because we both, at separate times, have visited a museum in Jackson, Mississippi. I think it's the Mississippi State History Museum or some catchy name like that. But in 1890. There were 140,000 Black Mississippi men registered to vote, 140,000. In 1892, there were like 6,500. And there were 110,000 white men registered in 1890. And in 1892, there was like 75,000. So it hit them too. And so and to get back to your point that's when they realized they needed grandfather clauses to say, we want to get these poor white men back on the voter rolls so that they don't feel disenfranchised to go, hey, we're getting screwed over here too. Some things never change. Welcome to America, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
No, it is the same fights that our country's been dealing with since the inception. And, you mentioned the Greg Palast article, and also the Brennan Center for Justice does great work on what the states are doing to restrict voting. The founding of our country, I mean, you were talking about the Articles of Confederation and how we changed to the Second Republic that we're currently living in. But that was driven by, there was a guy, Daniel Shea, in Western Massachusetts who led a rebellion. And suddenly the property classes says, wait, we have to have a stronger federal government to protect our interests. And that's when they put together, well, we need an upper chamber to cool off any, popular support for anything that would affect property classes. And then the Electoral College, too, was a way of suppressing votes. And, originally even the Senate was appointed by state legislatures. It wasn't a direct vote for your senator. So, it's baked into our system, the white supremacy. And right now we are in a moment of time when people want to go back to that. They don't like a pluralist democracy. And the white Christian nationalists, who are the main support for MAGA, have a stranglehold on all three federal branches. And yeah, we're just less than a month into the intentional chaos, cruelty, and criminality that this is producing. But it does harken back to we've been 40 years now to try to get America reawoken to the 1950s or before, and they're getting there very quickly.
Yeah, the past 3 weeks have been extremely eye-opening in terms of how fast things have moved. I was looking back at a talk I gave last summer, maybe even in the spring, when we just started hearing about Project 2025 and people started reading it going, holy, this is unbelievable. And what I told the audience then, at some of the things they were going to try to do in the first 100 days, and it only took them 21 days. I mean, a lot of those things have already come to pass that we were so concerned with. And it all goes back to who gets to vote and who we limit their ability to vote. I thought it was great that you brought up, Cynthia, the issue of gerrymandering. I mean, that has been going on for years, but now with technology, you can pretty much pinpoint which house you want to be in your district. I mean, let alone neighborhood or zip code. I remember after a census maybe 20, 30 years ago, in the liberal enclave of Austin, Texas, people did a survey and went around and asked residents of Austin who their member of Congress was. And they had no idea, because what the Republican-led legislature had done is divvy up Austin into 5 separate congressional districts so that none of those liberal Austin folks would actually have representation. So like a spoke in a wheel, all of those districts went way out into the exurbs and into rural areas. So it was ensured that one party would win. And after the last redistricting, they finally said, okay, Austin's too big. We'll just cram as many of them as possible into one district and give you all that one. And now Tennessee did the same thing in their last redistricting to Nashville. I lived there a number of years ago, and we always had one representative who represented pretty much the city of Nashville and a little outskirts, and it was always what he referred to himself as a blue dog Democrat. But now Nashville is separated into 3 separate congressional districts, all of them very uncompetitive. And so I think that, again, with the increase in technology and data, that's going to become an increasingly an area of increasing importance in terms of elected officials choosing who their voters are, rather than voters choosing who their elected officials are.
Wow. And with that, we're going to close out the historic portion. And just for the record, the president who oversaw the end of Reconstruction was Rutherford B. Hayes. So for that tidbit of history there, right? Yeah. So that will actually lead us into what is going on currently, Stephen. And I think it would be great for you to start off this discussion with what we've seen in recent years, and also what we can look out for, what the work of the Secular Coalition entails, and what we can continue to look out for when it comes to our elected officials and any bills and policies that may be passed.
Sure. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, I think Cynthia did a great job of hitting on a lot of it, which is the voter suppression that we hear about, right? Limited early voting, changing the requirements in order to even get registered, having your registration be challenged by somebody who maybe doesn't even live in your state, let alone have any idea if you're actually an eligible voter. In many states, as she mentioned, they limit the polling location or they move it so that it is more inconvenient for those perhaps without their own car to get to. One of the things that I think going forward is we'll see what North Carolina did in terms of when their districts were contested for being racially gerrymandered. And the party that did the gerrymandering said, well, of course we wouldn't gerrymander congressional districts or legislative districts because that would be illegal. So what we did is we gerrymandered them based on political party. And the North Carolina Supreme Court at the time said, okay, that's good. We are good with that. Yep. Gosh, don't do anything based on race. And so their gerrymandered districts, continue. One of the things that is going to be increasingly difficult to do is something that the state of Iowa did like 40 years ago. And that was to create a legislative districting commission, which is a bunch of independent voices that set the boundaries not only for the congressional districts in the state, but also for the state Senate and the state House. And interestingly, in the past election, Iowa's 4 congressional districts, it's a small state, but we're using it as a good example. 3 of them were actually considered competitive. In the state of Texas, which has like 42 congressional districts, 2 of them were considered competitive. So in terms of voter suppression, even if you get to vote, your vote probably may not matter in most congressional districts because it's already predetermined which party's candidate is going to win. And it works both ways, right? Like Maryland and Illinois Democrats did their share of gerrymandering as well. So it works both ways, but in the current environment, nobody does it like a state with a red trifecta. Thank you, Mandisa. Let me back up a little. Hi, I'm Stephen Everett with the Secular Coalition for America. SCA was founded in 2002 by a small group of people who kind of looked around and said there's some great organizations out there doing a lot of great things for the atheists, the humanists, the agnostic, the non-believers. But there's really very little presence in Washington, D.C. to focus on lobbying and talking to elected officials about the separation of church and state and other issues that we feel strongly about. And so the SCA was created to sort of fill that void. Since that time, a number of organizations that are members of ours have sort of set up shop or at least have a presence here in DC, which is terrific. So we have an officially registered lobbyist, but so do a couple of other member organizations. So we represent those 21 member organizations here on the Hill on a regular basis to try to influence legislation, either pro or against. And we also highly encourage members of Congress to join what is called the Congressional Freethought Caucus, which is truly a group of members of Congress who fight diligently to ensure the separation of church and state. Most of the members of that caucus actually have some religious affiliation, but they strongly support the separation of church and state because they recognize, as we do, that it's more than just freedom of religion. It's freedom from religion, and it's keeping not only the church out of our government, but it's also for the members of a congregation keeping your government out of your church. So it works both ways. We have a lobby day coming up March 11th, which is a Tuesday. If you happen to be anywhere near DC and can join us, that would be great. We have a reception the night before that will be held in the Rayburn House office building. It's very cool because generally one or more members of Congress will join us and talk to the group. Then on that Tuesday, the 11th, we will set up the meetings for you so you don't have to do it. And you will go and meet with you don't generally get to meet with your state senator or with your U.S. senator or your member of Congress, but you certainly get to talk to someone in their staff. And they always recognize that for a constituent to fly out to Washington, D.C., it's a big damn deal. And so nearly, I can't no longer say 100%, but nearly 100% of the visits go extremely well because as a constituent, you're kind of the boss. So we help train you for those who haven't ever done that before, but it's really a great experience. It's a huge sort of lesson in American civics. But where we are currently, it's become a little bit more tenuous. One of the things that I think we recognize here in DC is that we aren't passing much legislation. Not many bills have been introduced. We still haven't funded the government for this year, let alone for next year. And everything that's happening is happening through executive order. And I think if you're on this call, you probably followed the news enough to know what that has meant, just in terms of the constitutional crisis that we're now in and the difficult position courts are being asked to be, they are being put in, and in terms of what is being asked of them, because we have an executive office who is currently willing to push all boundaries, rules, and norms to get as much power as they can. And obviously, it's had the intended effect. The numbers that I have seen of co-president Elon's net wealth since the term started is just astounding. And unfortunately, that's where we are. But it also means we have to yell at your professional. Thank you, Cynthia. It also means that it's even more important that we show up and make our presence known and are loud and proud about the fact that we have got to put a stop to this madness. And we know we're in the majority. And so we've got to make our voices heard. And so it'd be great if you could join us in March. We certainly have the opportunity to waive registration fees if that's an issue, because I don't want that to be an issue. But join us if you can. It's important now more than ever, I think. Oh, and to follow up on one of your other comments, Cynthia, when Mandisa calls me with this great idea, I'm like, oh, that's outstanding. We have a great conversation about how it could work. And the next day, I see, once again, we're going to the state of Iowa, Secretary of State purged 180,000 voters from their rolls. And, again, Iowa's not that big, 180,000. It's huge. And you just go, just in your face with it.
Yeah, it makes you tired, but you can't stop, right?
I know, but it's too important, so we keep going.
Well, if there was any
comment, we're already after 9:00.
Yeah, if anyone had any commentary, Ron or Cynthia, on what Stephen had to say, then please.
No, it really is about building relationships, building our visibility. So lobby days are incredibly important. The elected officials have to know that there is an atheist and humanist community out there, that there's a movement out there, that we are constituents, we're an important constituency. And, once they get to know you, all the preconceptions that they have about what is an atheist will just drop away. So relationship is really important. And yeah, representing our movement. It's the only way we're going to get rid of this lingering bias against us.
That's a really good point, Ron. And if I could, one quick example is having worked for Planned Parenthood for many, many years all over the country. And someone told me that she was in the gallery watching a debate around some reproductive rights issue in her state capital. And her state senator got up and said, I have never heard one of my constituents ever say that, she or he would support this. And so I'm against it because I'm pro-life, blah, blah. And she realized that she and her friends who were his constituents never had mentioned that to him because they knew he was so anti, right? So it was like, she said, I vowed then never to let that happen again. They have to know that they have constituents who feel this way. And I was like, that is such a good example of why it's so important to say, we may not be in agreement, but you need to know you're representing me too.
Yeah, and just to kind of just like piggyback on what Ron and Stephen said, that a lot of times representatives on the state level and also on the federal level will easily glance over you if you don't make your presence known. And a lot of times they won't really, say the right things unless we make them. And it's important if you, and I understand, like, it may be a bit of a trek in order for one to make that little pilgrimage over to Washington, D.C. ever so often to say, like, hey, this is happening and I care about it. It can be a bit of a hard, hill to climb. But in essence, it's still very important to do so. And and even though that, like, you have like people who happen to be in the secular community who are, of different races and, of different backgrounds, and we had different upbringings, I think that there are certain issues that we can also say that we care about that intersect. And it makes more of a powerful stand when you have a diverse portion of us that are coming together in order for us to collectively yell at our representatives. And I promise, like Stephen, I'm not going to yell like really loud. I it's more of a slow burn is what I plan on doing, because it's just absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And also, you don't have to go to Washington to do it. In-district meetings are incredibly powerful, and you don't have the travel. You can organize members of your group and community, attend candidate forums, and also they have in-district meetings for, the population. Just go to those, be visible, wear your little stickers so that you're visible. But again, it's being there, it's building relationships, it's making yourself known. So you can do it every day.
All right. And this leads us to the final portion with Ron from the Center for Freethought Equality. And for those who might be, who might not be as well versed or well informed about how to get involved and how to stay involved, and also resources that are available for you moving forward. Because we have to consider how we move forward, especially in this current political climate. So we'll have Ron take it away for this final portion of moving into the future.
All right. Thank you very much, Mandisa, for inviting me to do this. And thanks for everybody for participating. Again, I'm Ron Millar. I'm with the Center for Freethought Equality, which is the advocacy and political arm of the American Humanist Association. I particularly run the political action committee that we have. When I started back in 2016, we knew of just 5 state legislators who identified with our community throughout the United States. So that's over 7,000 seats, and we had 5 of them. So that's pretty dismal. It's gotten a little better. We now know about 70 state reps who identify with us publicly in 33 states. But we still need another 1,500 or so to reach parity. So we've got a long, long haul to go. We've just started scratching the surface. In Congress, when I started, we didn't have any member of Congress identify with us Pete Stark was the first, and actually that was when I was working with the Secular Coalition for America. We had a contest, and he came out as the first ever member of Congress to identify with our community back in 2007. Working with the Center for Freethought Equality, it took us 10 years to get the second guy to identify with our community, Jared Huffman, from California, and he identifies as a humanist and agnostic. And then in the next following year, he had a bunch of people come up to him and say, how brave it was for him to come out. And when we had dinner with him, when he was thinking about making the announcement, we broached several ideas to him, and we said, we'd love to see a caucus on Capitol Hill, but you can't be a caucus of one. But he proved us wrong, because the people who were so supportive of him, his colleagues, they decided to form a caucus, and that happened in 2018. And this year, we have 2 new members of Congress who identify with us, Yaz Ansari from Arizona's 3rd, and Emily Randall from Washington's 6th. Ansari identifies as an agnostic. Randall identifies, when they asked what her religion was, she said none. So we're working to get some clarification on what does it mean when you say that you're a nun. But we haven't had that conversation yet, but we will. So that's what we're doing. We're using the PAC as sort of a fishing license to reach out to elected officials and candidates to see if they identify with us, to make them know that there is a community out there that will support them, and also to help candidates who identify with our community to encourage them to run for office. So I'm going to take this voter suppression thing in a little different angle, because it's pretty dismal about voter suppression, and it's probably only going to get worse in the next 2 years. So what I want to say is that, voting is incredibly important, but it is the last act that you can do in the political arena. There is so much more that individuals need and must do. And part of the problem in our society is that for the last 40 or so years, we've been conditioned to think of ourselves as consumers rather than citizen participants in our society. I mean, I think maybe some of you remember the rousing words of President George W. Bush after 9/11, that what should citizens do? They should go shopping to recover from this catastrophe. So, we've been led to believe that that's our role, that we are simply consumers. And even in the electoral arena, that's true. The media portrays elections as, who has the best poll numbers, who has the biggest rallies, and we're sort of just consuming this news. And then sort of a spin-off of American Idol, we get to cast our vote at the end to see who is the most popular. And that's just not the way a healthy democracy works. We need to have a participatory democracy where we are all active. So, we don't have to be passive consumers. We must be active participants in the political process. And if we want to defeat MAGA and white Christian nationalism, that's the only way to do it, because they are active participants and they have boatloads of money. And even though they're a smaller portion of our society, they have an outsized voice because they are engaged. And until we meet that level of engagement, we're not going to stop, and I love to use these terms, white Christian nationalists, they have this anti-democratic, bigoted, anti-science, racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, and homophobic crusade. And we are the community if we can get activated to take them on and defeat them. But we've got to get organized, and we're trying to do that work. So what I really encourage you to do is, think about your participation in the electoral process and the political process, and, work to step up your game. There's a lot of people who only vote in presidential elections. And so if you're at that level, I encourage you to be an informed voter and vote in all elections and at all levels of government. So it does take time to do the research, but there are great resources out there. The League of Women Voters does Vote 411. There's Ballotpedia. There is Smart Voter. I think I'm saying that wrong, but there are resources out there, and you also find them on my website at the Center for Freethought Equality. I have little resources about what you can do as an individual, what you can do as a group, and what you can do to run for office. So look up those resources and get involved. So if you're already a very engaged and very informed voter, then I urge you to take that up a step, because the next thing to do is invest your time and money in campaigns. To get your candidate to succeed, you got to make an investment. And, it doesn't have to be a huge investment. Just a few hours, a few dollars will go a long way. It just shows that you're participating and that you're supporting the candidate that you want to win. It also gives you an idea on how campaigns are run, what it takes to win an election by participating in campaigns. So it's a great training ground too for you. So if you're already at that level, then I urge you to meet with your elected officials, like we were talking before, attend public meetings, ask questions, advocate for a cause, build those relationships with your elected officials, let them know that you're out there. And so if you're at that level, there's still more to do. Then you can take a leadership position in your preferred political party. You can start out as a precinct captain and see where it goes from there. You can also participate in various government commissions and councils that provide advice on topics that you might be passionate about. There's at the local level, there's almost a commission or council on every issue you can imagine. I mean, whether it's parks and recreation, public health, aging services, planning and zoning, once you build your relationships with your elected officials and local government, you'll see what's out there that you can participate on. And this is a way to build the network of support. It gets us visibility. It gets you a better understanding of what's happening, and also attend, school board meetings, attend city council meetings just to see what happens, how the process works, so that you're a better informed citizen, and speak out at those meetings, because the opposition does. Especially at school boards, they love tearing down public schools. And so they need people out there to support public schools. So if you built the relationships, built the visibility, you have this now network of supporters or people and people you can ask money from, perhaps, that's the time to think about running for office, because we have to be making the decisions if we want to make change. And the best way to do that is be in an elected office. There are 500,000 local and municipal seats out there. So there might be one that's just perfectly tailored for you. And some of them, getting on the ballot is just a matter of getting 15 signatures and submitting it, and you're on the ballot. And then you've got to obviously put in the time to win the race. But there are a lot of seats out there, actually, that are begging for candidates. I knew a person back in my hometown where they have elected auditors, and nobody was running. So he just decided to become an auditor and became one office. So again, it's sort of like the commissions. There are great things out there that you can do with little effort. I mean, obviously, you've got to make sure that, your survival is the first thing that you're worried about. Getting by is key. But if you have that extra time, go for it. Before you make any big decisions, though, you want to talk to your family members to make sure that they're on board. The last thing you want to do is, fill up your time with other things and then having your domestic commitments struggle for it. So everybody has to be on board before you run for office, or even join some of these commissions, or even dedicate a lot of your time to volunteering. And maybe you get the whole family involved in some volunteering activities. So it's a good outing. And especially with campaigns, they'll pay for the pizza. So there you go. It's a free meal and some exercise, doing some door knocking. So my thing is, be engaged. We cannot be passive members of this society, especially when they're trying to take what little civilization we have away from our society. So please get engaged. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Use our website resources we have on our website. We have lists of all the elected officials who identify with us. Again, we have the resources about what you can do as an individual, what you can do as a group. If your group's a 501c3, don't be frightened about working in political areas, because there's lots of things 501c3s can do. You just have to be nonpartisan. You can't endorse candidates, you can't appear to endorse candidates, and you can't endorse political parties. So you stay away from that. There's a lot of things you can do, and there's this great program called Boulder Advocacy, BOLDER, that spells it all out, what you can and cannot do. So it'll keep you safe to keep your C3 status. So again, this is a very desperate time, but with the desperate times, it's an opportunity for us as a community to unite and fight back and do some good for the country. So take any questions or comments from my other fellow panelists.
Learned something tonight, Ron. 500,000 different elected offices.
A lot of local seats in the world.
Yeah, and that's always where traditionally there's been trouble filling them, right? Because it's always like, oh, somebody will do that, and then,
We have
So
a question.
you would go to like your like I live in a township, right? So I would go to the township office and find out what seats there are, period.
It varies state by state. Sometimes it's run by the township, sometimes it's run by the county. A lot of places it's the county board of elections or the clerk of the county that controls the information about elections. But
Okay.
Awesome. So yes, thank you all very much. And I think we have Tina, who is representing our Charlotte affiliate. And after that, I have a question for you, Ron, and I think it might be a common one as it pertains to people getting involved in running for local offices. So Tina, take it away.
Hey, so can you guys see me? First of all, reason I was late is because I was elected captain in my precinct this evening. It's not my first time at the rodeo. I have been precinct captain. I have been a chair of my local senior group within my party. And then I've also been the state caucus president for my senior caucus here in my part for my party. So just I guess I have comments. So when you sometimes approach your elected officials, especially on the local level, make sure this is something that I learned probably about 30 years ago. Put some money aside at the beginning of the year, but budget some money so that you can give this one $25, that one $25, that one $25, and especially on the local level, because then you can go to councilman, whoever, and say, oh, by the way, I'm a donor, because a lot of times they just want to brush you away, like, I don't have time with you. Oh, yes, you do, because I gave you some money, and you wouldn't have been here without my money. The other thing I will say, running not running, but just being in these circles, especially here in the South, as an atheist, it can you don't get invited to the cookout a lot of times. I don't know, like when I was elected as the state caucus chair, I don't know how I got away with it, because I was very open with who I was, except I didn't use the word atheist. I used the words non-religious, because that's a softer blow. And people took that as however they wanted to take it, but they voted me in. And so those are my comments. Like, if you're going to run, you might want to say you're a humanist or non-religious. And when I've heard other candidates and elected officials say I'm non-religious. I knew what that meant. I knew what that meant, but I wasn't going to bring it up in front of anybody, except when I would see said candidate or elected official, it would be wink and nod. Yeah, I know who you are. But we have to do what we have to do in order to get elected. And that was it. That's just my comment.
Thank you for that, Tina. That does make sense. And we appreciate all of your advocacy and activism, especially when it comes to reproductive health as well. That is a huge one that we're so facing especially in this political climate. Jeez.
We're holding our breaths. We are holding our breaths in North Carolina. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely.
Don't forget the abolitionist work too.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, in my 5 years of us sitting out in front of the governor's mansion every December, we have a total of 77 people that he gave clemency to. He commuted sentences, he pardoned folks, and I think he took off a bunch of people from death row this year, which is which is great. I mean, I'd say 77 down, 30,000 more to go. But here we are.
Awesome.
Can I ask a quick question of you, Tina?
Mm-hmm.
Completely off topic. What's going on with that Supreme Court race where the losing parties trying to all of a sudden take away 60,000 voters?
Yes.
You can't do that. Their votes for other races would go away. Craziest thing ever.
So finally, I think it was in Superior Court in Wake County, that's where Raleigh is. Yeah. They said, enough of this nonsense. She's the judge, 60,000 votes. So we were like, yay, finally.
Right.
And then today, was it today or yesterday? Now he's going to the NC Supreme Court, Court of Appeals. And I'm like, you lost. Dude, you lost. But he's just
some candidates have difficulty admitting that, right? Some of them just refuse to admit when it's clear they've lost. There's no evidence otherwise.
He lost. He lost. Yes, what is it? Changing the goalposts, every time. And I'm just like, okay. And that's why I became precinct captain tonight. The party came to me and just asked, I said, after I did the state thing, I said, no, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. They came to me and said, would you just organize a precinct? I said, okay, I can do that. Because I think that a lot of people need to understand, see, how can I say this? Is that sometimes your own party can do dastardly deeds within your county.
Sure.
And which is why a lot of the young people, when they're pointing their fingers saying, it's them, it's the D people, and I'm like, yes, but you have to get involved. And I say this constantly over and over again. You have to understand the system in order to tear it down. And in order to understand that system,
know what you're up against.
You have to be part of it. You have to be part of it. And I say it over and over to these kids, and I'm just like, okay, I'll be the old person out on the lawn. Get off my lawn and vote.
Bring your friends with you and knock on doors before. Anyway.
Yes, the whole thing.
So that brings me to a question for Ron, especially about getting people involved in civic engagement, whether it's on local, state, or federal levels. I know that, ultimately, outside of the presidential election, and people don't realize that, it can be a very tedious process. So how is it that people constituents who might be looking to get involved and perhaps run for office, what else should they expect to be in for? Because I know some of these seats are probably not paid positions, or they don't pay much, Or, what should people expect, and how can it be more inviting for people to get involved and run for office?
Well, you really need to find your passion, to be honest with you, or because, it might be that, you're just crazed about the book bans. And so, look into running for a library board. And the key thing is know what you're getting into. So you have to go to the board meetings to see what they do, see who's there, what is their resume, how did they get there, and then if you want to take on that seat, or if you see someone that needs to be replaced, then you work with other people who see that they need to be replaced, and you build your network of support. Again, it's working within the structures that are out there, building your alliances, building the knowledge. But yeah, you don't want to just jump into a race without doing any research, because you need to know what you're getting into, and you need to know how you can be effective once you're in that position, because there's a very limited amount of time learning on the job before you'd be back up running for election again. So you want to hit immediately to know who you're working with, who you can count on, what you want to move forward, and who's going to support you to move your issues forward.
Awesome. And so we had a question earlier in the chat. The question is, how can we find out how many voters were purged from the rolls in each state and how many votes were not counted? If that's even possible to find out, but how can that happen?
I did put a link in the chat. I think that I put in one about the Brennan Center for Justice, if I'm not mistaken. They do a lot of work in that area as far as kind of acting as a watchdog to see who, what states have been kind of guilty of taking people off of the voters' rolls, and also how many who initiated it. And there's other organizations that's out there that kind of act as watchdogs as well. I know that reading some of the literature from Greg Palast, that he talked about how he had to basically do a lot of sleuthing and dig for some of this information so that he can pull data concerning who was taken off the voter rolls. And he would contact a lot of times the local election offices in order for them to get that data. Now they're supposed to be a freedom of information that is supposed to be given, but if sometimes some of these particular outlets see that you are trying to pull data on stuff like this, but they don't necessarily want you to do it, they'll fight you. But you kind of have to be resilient in order for you to be able to pull that information so that you can see what's going on. But I know for myself, and I know that me and Mandisa have talked about this before, a lot of times that there are people that are already in the trenches that are doing the work. A lot of times, if you can kind of just support them in order for you to say, not only am I going to donate, but I can also possibly help, gather data or, pull information or whatever you need me to do. That, that's usually a better, thing to do as well, so that you can get the information to assist.
Let's get on my PJ. Awesome. Tina, did you have another question or another comment?
Just another comment. So I don't know how other states do it, but in our county in North Carolina, there is what's called a curing process, right? So you don't even have to sign up. You go to your board of elections and you sit down and you watch them as they have stacks of ballots or whatever, and they will decide whether this vote counts, whether that vote counts. Well, this one signed up the day of, but he didn't have an ID and he didn't come back in time to show his ID. So we're going to throw that one out. Now, depending on who's on your board of elections, it's supposed to be an odd number of representatives from each of the major parties. So whoever's in charge, they're trying to throw out as many of the ones ballots, if you will. And it is tedious. I mean, sometimes you just want to watch paint dry, but it's a way to hold Board of Elections accountable. That I'm watching you, I'm seeing what you're doing, and a lot of candidates, especially local candidates, will show up at those hearing processes. So I mean, that's what we do here. I don't know about other states.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that, Tina. We will make our final closing statements. If no one else has any other questions, there have been links for each of our organizations shared in the chat. So if you'd like to learn more and get involved, you definitely want to look up the organization Secular Coalition for America, Center for Freethought Equality, and Black Nonbelievers, because we all work in tandem with each other. And again, if you didn't think that you could get involved, whether it's politically or as a community, a participant or an activist, it is it is actually easy to get into, easier than you think. And it just takes time and commitment. And like Ron said, just working with your family, working with the people in your life, and make sure that you have that support, because that is very, very important. So we'd like to take a few minutes, and also thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ron, for joining us. And thank you to everyone who registered and tuned in.